Hi everyone. So just a brief introduction to explain why you are doing this way. As you know, I was supposed to be away today. Today when you're watching this, I'm doing this on Tuesday. Dave is a bit laid out with problems with his back. So the idea of the walking tour for the first thing this morning has now turned into a few bits of recordings from myself, some readings, and doing our best to try and make the whole thing work. So I'm going to want to just introduce a little bit of the day. Invite you to look at two very familiar sites, the YMCA building, which is where I'm standing, and the King David Hotel, which is on the other side of the road, and say a few thoughts about that, why that's the opener for today, and then also to read text which is up on canvas, which I'll talk about in a second. Then head to the auditorium where you can zoom into Zoom, and Dave will give the lecture that he was always planning on doing, and then go out, and then there'll be a little bit more recorded stuff from me, and then head to the other side, blah blah blah. Okay, so very briefly, the idea, I think, in terms of moving ourselves on, is that for today and for next week's Israel seminar, we're staying, and that brings us an end really to the pre-state period kind of chronology, setting the scene kind of Israel seminar stuff, of trying to say a few things, both about the period of the British Mandate and also the other changes that are going on in terms of our big themes. If one looks at it this way, in 1917, the British troops take control of the defeated Ottoman forces, and this comes under the control of the British, which for the purposes of now we briefly mentioned that last week in Tel Chai, but for the purposes of our story and for learning about Israel, of course, what it means is all the rules of engagement between the Yishuv, the Zionist movement, the Jews of Palestine, and any aspiration towards a national homeland, they have a new address. It's now the British. It's an imperial power, different imperial power, and but one that's coming from northwestern Europe and not from the Balkans and Islamic. The significance behind that, of course, is deeply felt by the Zionist movement in ways which Dave will no doubt explain in his presentation a bit later. What I wanted to refer to, though, really was frame it a little bit of that, to say that we need to be at least cognizant of that. Again, like all these things, before rushing headlong into our analysis of Israel, Israeli society, the Arab-Israel conflict, and so on, to try and make sure that we've done the necessary kind of stages along the way. The period under the British will be, amongst other things, a period in which both Palestinian Arab national voices will rise up and make themselves heard, and will assert their right to not be living under a colonial ruler, and so in the same way that Zionist and Jewish ones are. So in other words, there's a little bit of a frame of this that takes us towards understanding more about the conflict. Parallel to that, there is a cultural story, the evolution, the development, the changing landscape of this country, which becomes different. More people are living here. There is an energetic imperial ruler that is building different buildings to the ones that the Ottomans had left behind and had built for 500 years. And all the time, you know, the story of immigration, of the arrival of new waves of immigrants, second Aliyah before the First World War, third Aliyah after the Second World War during the period of the Mandate, and then in the 20s the fourth Aliyah from Poland, and in the 30s of the fifth Aliyah coming from Germany, Austria, very much connected towards affairs in Europe. There's changes afoot, and every time new waves of immigrants come, that of course only makes the future look grimmer, darker, more problematic for the local Arab Palestinian population. But by the way, whilst all that's happening, the Jews of this area will say, but we're also local, we are also connecting, and so on and so forth. So that's all there for the taking. What I wanted to say by choosing two sites is, and by the way, ones which you walk past, I mean, again, depending on which end of the street you walk past when you leave college, but ones which are very familiar and always worth coming to, is to set up an interesting, I don't know, for me, a little challenge, I think, about a way in which tourism invites us to think intelligently. Essentially, it's the ongoing question of where does the eye go? What's the tourist gaze, to use their language, and a language I'll use on other occasions? In other words, when you walk up the street, on two sides of the road, at the same spot, you have YMCA, planning to be built in 1929, The architect is the same chap, by the way, who designs the Empire State Building. But on the other side of the road is the King David Hotel, being built largely through investment from Egyptian Jewish bankers, and but investment from inside and outside the country. But a building in a very different style. So the two styles of these two buildings is a curiosity, and in a way helps try and, I hope, pose what may be just a rhetorical question, but maybe something interesting as well. I should say, by the way, the street that we're referring to, which is today King David Street, it hasn't always been called King David Street. For most of its history, it was known as Julian's Way. It's a reference taking back into Christian mythology. So what do we see in the YMCA? A building built sort of a little bit with an image of a minaret as the central tower. By the way, a minaret of a particular style, closer to the Giralda in Seville, but significantly a central building over there, but with buildings on this side and buildings on that side. Not great with selfie sticks, sorry. Whatever, back to me. Sorry. A building which is very much designed in the style of the Orient, very designed to be in some way reflective of, with domes and minarets, something which seems very much native and part of the land. It's Eastern in its orientation. And by the way, the YMCA used it. I mean, the YMCA was then and now, I mean, it's local, in this case, owned, the property in the area and the land owned by Arabs in Jerusalem. Very much an Eastern-looking building. There's no exclusivity, by the way. The three buildings are part of its language. It very consciously wanted to create a building that acknowledges the three monotheistic faiths. Three parts of the building, three monotheistic faiths. Admittedly, the largest one is the Christianity, and there are various phrases. If I just train in a little bit, you can just see there the foundation plaque over here. Feel free to come and have a look at it. But language by Lord Allenby, of British fame, very much referencing a kind of an optimistic and a peaceful image of what this building is supposed to do, to draw people together. But the point is, it tries to be of the land and of the culture of the region. If I now just, very exciting, by the way, filming on a mobility scooter. There we go. There's the King David Hotel. Now, I could probably cross the road and do this, but then I'd have to, and it gets too complicated. But suffice to say, you should just be able to see the outlines of the King David Hotel. What's going on for the King David Hotel, and why flag it up as different? The thinking was, in the city planners, was that a emerging centre needed to have a monumental hotel, a kind of hotel where kings and queens would go. And by the way, kings and queens did come and visit here very, very early on. It was opened in 1931. But the style of the hotel is anything other than Eastern. It's distinctly Western in its orientation. It uses a building style which you could find at the Georges V in Paris, in the Adlon in Berlin, and a whole host of other monumental hotels in London. And it's very much to sort of say, this is Europe, this is the West. And that, in a way, is sort of an out left field, maybe coming in from the edge, kind of way of trying to say there's a question. The moment that we talk about, the development of the country in any of the periods, and it's not to say that, there's always been development, whether it's fast development or very slow development. And I think that was always the argument, that the empires speed up the pace of development. The Ottomans built a lot at a certain period, a little bit later on, but actually it was quite a slow paced development. In this accelerated period of development, which mirrors the time period we're interested in, things move quickly. And we see the changing of the facade of the city. And I think, as I mentioned briefly the other day, truth of the matter is, New Jerusalem, begins in 1860 with the movement out of the old city. But really the significant development, and this should have come up, I think, on your walking tour of Rehavia with Ilan, it's pretty much same time zone as Tel Aviv. Let no one kind of try and kid you that Tel Aviv is the only new city. It's just it has a different self-consciousness, which is our conversation next week. But I think my rhetorical question to finish off this little introduction is to say this. If one is imagining a new country that is emerging under the control of the British, one which is done very much connected to and in dialogue with its populations, its Jewish and its Arab populations, in ways that are different, and by the way, ultimately in ways that are hostile, see reference the Arab-Israel conflict, which is just coming up, which way do we imagine this country is going to be? Is it going to be very European, Western in its orientation, which would fit the cultural aspirations of the emerging hegemonic power of Britain? Or is it respectful? Is it Eastern? Is it Middle Eastern? Is it blending in? And without being too kind of over the top about it, when you I don't suggest you do this, of course, because you'll get run over. But if you stand in the middle of former Julian's Way, now King David Street, and say, well, which of these two places, which of these two styles, the East or the West, speaks to me, and which is the version of Israel that I most want, an Israel which is Western in its orientation or Eastern in its European in its orientation? And of course, you know that this is deeply political. And I'm saying it on cultural terms, but actually it's a way of acknowledging that this is political, and where there's politics, there's very often conflict. Now, a different take on this is, I'm going to pause speaking in a second. I was going to read this aloud, but I realize it's enough of my voice. It's a reading that I want you to look at. If you look on Canvas, you'll find the reading for today from the book Tale of Love and Darkness, which was a wonderful text written by Amos Oz. And it's his early life. It's a complicated story. It was made into a not especially great film with Natalie Portman, but nonetheless, a lovely passage where Amos Oz in his childhood, who's growing up in what today is the centre of town, every week they would walk to see Uncle Joseph Klausner, very important Zionist figure, but a family figure, his uncle, in Talpiot. Talpiot, closer to where I live, but an emerging neighbourhood, which was seemingly on another continent. And what's beautiful about this little passage is that you are getting a guided tour of of Mandate Palestine through the eyes of a young Amos Oz, recounting locations. Now, so I'm going to invite you to find a spot, all of you together, maybe on the grass where it's shady, maybe read it together. One of you read the first paragraph and then pass it. You know what, you can read it whichever way you like, but it's better. I think it's nice to read it out if you can. And it gives you just a little bit of the mental sort of it paints a picture of what life looked like in a different Jerusalem to the one that we live in now. And that, by the way, I mean, it's very calm and it's a little bit of a window into life in Mandate Jerusalem at a certain time. Okay, and if any of the places seem familiar, yes, it's because it's a walk that you'd be very familiar with. Essentially, it takes you from the centre of town along what is now King George, all the way through down to where the railway station is. He references the railway, by the way, and out along Derech Hebron, what is Derech Hebron today, out to Talpiot. It's a lovely little piece. Read it, enjoy it, and then when you're all done, if you want to share any thoughts about it, feel free, but it's all setting the scene. It's all atmosphere building. Then head to the auditorium, and when you're all there, you want to click onto the Zoom and let Dave know, and then Dave will then pick up the story from there. I'm going to now, today it's Tuesday, Zoom to another place, record a different piece for a little bit later on in the morning.